So, in the last couple of video lectures, we talked about the basics of supply and demand, what determines the amount of demand coming from buyers' willingness to pay, what determines the level of supply, which is determined by seller costs. And now we're going to go ahead and look at how demand and supply interact together to create an equilibrium. So again, we're going to go back to our really simple example here, where we have a group of potential buyers and a group of potential sellers, and each buyer can buy 0 or 1 units. They buy if the price is below their willingness to pay, and they don't buy, they buy 0 units if the price is above their willingness to pay. Likewise, with sellers, each potential seller sells if the price is above their seller cost, or refuses to sell if the price is below their seller cost, and they would have to make a loss. We're going to use the same data as we did for our initial example here. So there's a list of buyers here, and each buyer has an associated maximum willingness to pay. And you can see that some people have a relatively low willingness to pay, like Allison, and other potential buyers are potentially willing to pay more. Same thing is true for the sellers here. The sellers, some of them are high-cost sellers that would need a really high price before it would be profitable for them to sell, and some of the sellers have lower costs and could profitably supply at even a fairly low price. So one question to look at here is, if the price were $53, who would be willing to buy at that price? And basically, you want to think about everyone who has a willingness to pay above $53, equal or above $53, would be willing to buy at that price. Who is willing to sell? Often students get turned around here. Remember that sellers like high prices, and they need to be able to run a profit before they're going to be willing to sell. So every seller who has a seller cost below $53 is going to be willing to sell. If we look at that data, we can go ahead and build a combined demand and supply schedule based on that. So if we had looked at that price of $53, we should have seen that there were 2 willing buyers and 4 willing sellers. So there's a typo here. There should be a surplus of 2 units because quantity supplied is 2 greater than quantity demanded. At a price of 48, we should see 3 willing buyers, so the lower price led 1 more buyer to be willing to buy, and quantity supplied should still be at 4. So at this case, there's a surplus of 1. A price of $42 would give us 3 buyers and 3 sellers, so that would be neither a surplus nor a shortage, and so on and so forth as we go down this table. So how does this get us towards the idea of equilibrium? So when we talk about equilibrium, we're thinking about a situation where things are stable, where things aren't changing. And I think it's important to sort of back up a little and realize that unchanging and stable is kind of a mixed bag. You could have a situation where things are unchanging and stable, but it's an undesirable situation, a bad equilibrium. And so often people want to say things like, equilibrium is a situation where supply and demand are in balance. And from a certain point of view, that's true, but I would be wary of thinking about it that way, because often when we say something is in balance, we mean that it's harmonious and desirable. And I would be cautious about thinking that we should be happy with every equilibrium in a supply and demand context, or later, if we talk about game theory, we're going to see that there are bad equilibria and good equilibria. In a formal sense, what is equilibrium? In general, going beyond just demand and supply, an equilibria is a situation where all the different actors say to themselves, given what everyone else is doing, I don't have any incentive to change what I'm doing. And of course, if everyone says this, then no one changes their actions, and we remain in the same steady state. This is actually the criteria of what's called a Nash equilibrium, and again, we'll come back to that in game theory. In the specific context, in a demand and supply model, equilibrium is when quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. And the reason why that's an equilibrium is that when prices are higher than equilibrium, or if there is a surplus, then that surplus puts downward pressure on prices. If prices are relatively low and there's shortages because more people want to buy than want to sell, that will tend to put upward pressure on prices. So if quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, there's neither a surplus nor a shortage, and so there's neither upward pressure on prices nor downward pressure on prices. So we're at a state of rest. Things are unchanging. And again, we may not be happy with that equilibrium. Prices could be very high, and that could be the equilibrium price. Or something like wages could be very low, and that could be the equilibrium wage. So again, we want to be cautious about thinking that just because something is in equilibrium, that it's the most desirable or happy with, or we should be happy about that.